reflect political contests and settlements between trade unions, corporate construction companies, and recruitment agencies. Her talk today addresses how the pandemic has changed the meanings of both touch and tech. A recorded version of the webinar will be available on the YouTube channel of CWS later. Please welcome Maitri Prasad Elyama. Over to you, Maitri.
Thank you, Navanita and Ankriti and everyone. I'm really happy to be here and to be able to present this work. This is the first time I'm presenting it, and a version of it has appeared in publication, but I want to develop it further. So this work, I mean, this is based on my experiences in New York while I was doing the postdoc as a person, who was newly there and experiencing the pandemic. And during the height of the pandemic, I lived with a family of frontline workers. One of them was a nurse in a COVID ward, a Malayali nurse, and another was with NYPD. So it was this microcosm of, and another relative of theirs was working with Chase Bank. So it was this microcosm of frontline and remote work, within that living arrangement. So this really, threw up a lot of questions for me in terms of how to understand that moment and what to make of it. And it was also important for me to use that moment to actually reflect upon it so that I can cope. So it was also a coping strategy. So my plan was to continue my work based on the fieldwork I had already done in India. But what I ended up doing around that time was this. And so it was that, that intensive experience that frames this. And so I'll try to read a little bit and then, try to explain and move along like that. I'll just show you a small picture. Oh, sorry. So this is, what in the summer of 2020, Uber in New York City announced that it would be partnering with Clorox to provide wipes to its riders and drivers to clean high-touch surfaces after each ride. These included the steering wheel, door handles, window button, trunk handle, food delivery bags, etc. This policy suddenly made the production of a service look like the production of goods, where the process of production was exposed as if one were at a factory shop floor. An Uber ride is typically a fleeting interaction, whereas this new policy reveals the production of a service behind the screens. One of the drivers reported that it took her 3 minutes per ride to clean the car, and the delay added up and affected how much she earned. Uber sent her masks and Clorox wipes, to disinfect, but she had to buy hand sanitizer and other cleaning products herself. Some drivers installed a plastic screen to divide the front and back seats as the front seat became out of bounds. So you can see it, see this picture, and it almost feels like a site of production of goods rather than a service. So we'll go back to another picture later. So the pandemic has forced capital and the state to re-examine many activities and work processes in terms of their potential to bring together people, their capacity to activate processes that would involve touch and proximity, and in terms of alternative modes of imagining work and consumption. when we say imagining, we always think, when we say imagine, reimagine, we always think of it as from the perspective of people or working class. We never think that that capital is also imagining, that the state is also imagining. So when I wrote this and showed it to a friend, she said, how can you use imagine, when you're talking about capital? So that's an interesting question, which we can actually think of. And especially alternative. These are all, reserved for people rather than capital. In this essay, I asked, what is the specific moment, a conjuncture in the historical development in the capitalist production process that the pandemic represents, and what are the changes the pandemic has brought into labor and work? There is no single answer to this question. My project here is to think through certain tendencies that we have seen in the past few months. And while overall the work is focused on what happened there during the height of the pandemic in New York and the US, I'm also looking at the way the literature on Southern urbanism has been used to understand the pandemic moment and the limitations. So once we finish this New York and US part, we'll slightly get into what the data shows about uh, what is termed as global south and the experience of the pandemic in the global south. Two modes of labor during the pandemic. So, as the pandemic forces us to examine what proximity and touch mean in the context of capitalism, we see that proximity involves sharing air, sharing food and water and their sources, and touching other people and touching things that they have touched. Manufacturing, transport, hotels and restaurants, hospitals, paid work, massages, teaching, sales, journalism, political and social activism, and most forms of working class labor involves physical contact with other people. On the other end of the spectrum, technological innovations, especially information and communication technologies, have made some of the need for proximity and touch obsolete. Many professionals had started managing and working remotely even before the pandemic, but only sporadically or seasonally. The symbiotic relationship between work and leisure that existed for some professionals had already wedged a divide among the working classes. The more off-site, managerial, technological, and highly paid your labor is, the more you were likely to experience this lack of boundary between leisure and labor. For example, many tech professionals have been traveling and coordinating work in multiple places and vacationing while working. Some others have been taking sabbaticals. A majority of workers, however, have had no such privilege of combining leisure and work. They are required to work on site and to observe strict time discipline. We can see that this wedge between the working classes in terms of control over their time and relative freedom to choose when to be present at the workplace was accentuated during the pandemic, but with some tweaks and shifts. For example, many professionals are able to bring their children from school, or take care of immediate social and reproductive tasks while working, like withdraw from the site of work, go back and forth. So that flexibility is something, and the limited control over time is something that had already wedged a divide between the working classes, which is not something we really talk about, because whenever we talk about working classes, we are always focused on uh, the lower level of the spectrum. Even while talking about the pandemic, and we always talked about migrant workers. We didn't see how the other half was, or other 10% or 1% was, what were they doing. So it's this is what interests me, to look at it together than just looking at uh, uh, the lower end of the working class only. The pandemic has changed the meaning of both touch and tech. It has drawn a line across occupations, work processes, and industries. It is a specific moment where production is separated not into the production of services and goods, but ones that are touch based and tech based. Touch based work are all forms of labor that involve proximity and touch. Tech based, on the other hand, can be performed through a computer screen and does not need immediate contact or proximity. In this sense, tech here refers not to technology per se, but to whether one can perform the work through a computer screen. It is a new iteration of the difference between mental and physical labor. So if we want to look at the very limited literature on labor process, we see that there is Taylorism, Fordism. If Taylorism, Fordism involved a division of labor between conception and execution that segregated workers into managerial and manual, and flexible accumulation, or flexible production processes involved a geographical division of labor between regions and sectors. What we have now is a division of laborers. So this is an analytical move I'm making, where it's definitely not a division of labor between mental tasks and physical tasks. It is also not a geographical division of labor per se, where you are moving production processes across, and that's how you are losing jobs. So it's not also that kind of system, but a caste system of workers into people who can work behind screens and people who cannot. And here we refer to Ambedkar in Annihilation of Caste, where he says that caste system is not merely a division of labor, it is also a division of laborers. But at the same time, we have to be careful to cleanly map these things onto what we think as status. So touch and tech is not a clean mapping of status, but it's a division of laborers, without getting into the status question too much, at least at this stage. Perhaps it's on its way. Its effect on the specific work processes in a sector is shaped by how much of it can be recast as screen labor that can be performed remotely. For touch-based workers, it is not so much as whether they are touching others at all, but whom they are touching and under what conditions. The racialized, gendered forms of vulnerability to contagion and premature death that touch involves is not merely a result of its physical nature, but the specific ways in which labor was retrenched and reorganized during the pandemic. It gives rise to an aspect of the violence and inequality of physical work, that is, exposure to disease, that have not been as visible before. So here, what we see is not merely touch causing death, but that your labor involves touch makes you exit the labor force, or you are made made to leave the labor force. So in that sense, what we see is very racialized, especially in the case of US, as we'll see later. And this reminds us of what Ruth Gilmore has talked about in Golden Gulag, where she says that basically she defines racism in the broadest possible sense, leaving color and skin color aside. She says that it's basically vulnerability to group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So this is a very useful way to look at the pandemic and the way it has the uneven distribution of both death and joblessness, and how to conceptualize that unevenness. Within industries and sectors, work processes have been divided on the basis of whether they can be performed remotely, meaning through a computer screen, with like teachers, CEOs, some artists, researchers, etc., with minimum contact, like delivery workers, shopkeepers, and those that involve extreme proximity or touch, like, for example, restaurants, care workers, doctors. I think doctors are a specific set of workers, because even though many move to tele conferencing, their basic, work process remained very touch based. So it's interesting. At the same time, dentists were considered like, you don't need to be, your dentists were considered not essential, even though it was high touch based. So which is why, I'm careful not to draw too much of a status thing into this, even though we recognize the division of laborers or classes of labor that this produces. These divisions partially capture the divide between essential and non-essential, as well as remote work and on-the-spot work. However, within an industry, there could be workers primarily involved in touch-based work, and others could be doing tech-based work. For example, in banking that is considered essential, tellers have to work in close contact with consumers, whereas IT workers and managers within the sector might get to work remotely. Education is not an essential sector, and teachers and administrators can work remotely, while security staff and cleaners become touch-based workers. Some of them might be categorized as essential workers depending on their exact job profile. For example, night security staff at the university building, they protect the property, right? So in that sense, they were considered essential suddenly, whereas teachers are not essential. So these are interesting things. Like, it's quite disparate actually when you pursue them very closely. Many occupations that were contact-based moved online and completely avoided touch-based work. For example, if a spa combined yoga classes, gym, and massages, the yoga class that previously involved close proximity indoors might have moved online. The gym, which involves collective use of on-site equipment, and massages that involve close contact, are rendered unsafe. So, in these new divisions that have emerged among the working classes, the pandemic has been mobilized and used to rework the workplace arrangements, building on existing divisions. So now many people would say that, what would happen in the long term? These might be short term, which we don't know, but we are actually looking at this moment and its durability actually beyond what we have imagined. The next section is titled The Politics of Touch and the Social Contract of Demobilization. Recessions have the capacity to lay bare the geometries of power that underlie everyday economic life. They affect different categories of workers and businesses differently. The politics of touch that underlies these differential rules of demobilization for manufacturing and hospitality industries comes out starkly in the statistics that came out by December 2020 in the US. So basically, what we see is that in the first 2 weeks of COVID shutdowns in April 2020, 10 million Americans filed for unemployment. And at the height of the pandemic, it was 23 million. The leisure and hospitality industry lost 7.7 million jobs, or 47% of total positions. So the vast majority of the industry's layoffs were in food service. The government said 5.5 million chefs, waiters, and cashiers lost jobs. These jobs that involved in-person service, and so basically what we see here is that it's not only about protecting these workers, but the capacity of these workers to infect anybody through touch and proximity, including the bourgeoisie. And I'm using bourgeoisie here because I'm talking about the US. I hope that's okay. So it had a different risk profile than factory-based work. In factories, so once you look into factories, it's a different story. In factories and shop floors, the infection can be contained among the working classes if higher managerial positions can be carried out online. Taking for example, the study by Samaniago and Mans, it's a wonderfully focused, almost ethnographic study of the meat processing industry in the state of Utah. So I'll show you a picture that talk about this. Just a second. So this research showed that Latin and or immigrant workers in the shop floor were considered expendable and were expected to continue working amidst a COVID outbreak in the plant. So there was a COVID outbreak, but the workers were asked to work even while they were infected and were being infected. The managerial workers were mostly white, did not have to work in close proximity to each other. Can you see this?
Yes, we can see it, ma'am.
Okay. Yeah. So this is the racial characteristics of COVID-19 in Cache Valley, Utah. So if you look closely here, we don't have anything like this in India, even at local level like this. Desegregation on the basis of caste or ethnicity. How many people from which caste background was affected or not, we don't know yet. How many people died from which caste, we don't know. But and Utah is considered a conservative state, but apparently this was taken down after a while when it became very controversial. So if you look closely, you can see that Black or African Americans are 0.7% of the population, but they constituted 6% of the cases. Hispanic and Latino people were 9% of the population, and they constituted 38% of the cases. And white people were 83% of the population, and they constituted 20% of the cases. So you can see the large disparity here. So this kind of disaggregated local level data is missing. I mean, of course, we know that a lot of statistics is missing, but this is something that can be undertaken, even at a smaller disaggregated, like a factory level or a panchayat level. But that disaggregation, that move to disaggregate data is absent in India. So this makes us, and also what we see in the US is that even though hospitality and leisure and all lost so much, unemployment in tech, that is tech sector, technology, IT sector, was only 3% in December 2020, stabilizing closer to the December 2019 rate of 2.3% after some ups and downs in the middle of the pandemic. So we see that tech wasn't affected much, and we'll see that this was the same in India as well. The demobilization of the workforce was a gendered process too, there, as many women employed in the hospitality sector suffered disproportionately higher unemployment rates. So now we can go to how. So there's this interesting paper by Gautam Phan and a couple of other scholars from the global south, especially from Brazil and South Africa and India. So they did a comparative study where this in the beginning of the pandemic, where they said that structures of inequality that now bear both the new imprint of COVID-19 while equally holding the continuities of older forms of distancing and exclusion. So what they are hinting at is that such grand claims regarding COVID as a portal, like Arundhati Roy has suggested, or how I think Agamben had suggested, how this is deepening of the exceptional state. So these kind of grand claims regarding the effect of the pandemic, they say that that's not how it works, at least in the global south. Life worlds that cannot be so clearly divided into before and after the pandemic, and where crisis and the everyday are not so neatly separable. So they also point to that there is an ongoing crisis anyway. So what is new here? How can people conceptualize the newness of the pandemic apart from the lockdown or the massive destruction that it has wrought? But at the same time, we have to bear in mind that it was written before the actual the second wave, the destructive second wave, when many on the left in the global south thought that, this was somehow not going to, I felt that in India, many people thought that, this is not going to affect in India in a bad way. And then it affected. So I feel that the way we framed the pandemic as an import from the global north, and especially like how Bhan et al. Are framing it as, how there cannot be the regular nature of the daily nature of crisis um, is already too heavy, and the pandemic is only going to intensify it. But at the same time, what we have seen is that that intensification is beyond something we can comprehend with the southern urbanism or post-colonial state kind of framework. They also point out that there has been a long unsettled relationship between the categories of home and work, between private and public space, even of who and what the family or the household is. So this is another, specificity where the global south and the collective life worlds in the global south stand in contrast to the way work is organized in the US and Europe. But at the same time, we have to remember that what is termed as collective life in Southern urbanism literature, or in general in post-colonial literature, is actually clusters of low value production. These, even though this sustains a lot of life, at the same time, it is also the other end of the global value chain, and it represents the unevenness of the global production networks, what we term as collective life in southern cities. So we cannot let culture do all the work. We need to bring in political economy and look at these value chains, how those are going to transform due to the pandemic. And I feel that looking at both the ends of the labor market, where we see a lot of professionals able to move into remote work, who are able to preserve their employment, and at the same time looking at workers who are losing livelihoods. And if you look at the data that was coming, during the second wave, 7.7 million people lost employment in India, and the salary job losses were disproportionately located in rural India. While urban salaried jobs accounted for 58% of total salaried jobs in 2019-20, they accounted for only 32% of the job losses till April 2021. Rural salaried jobs that accounted for 42% of the total, on the other hand, accounted for 68% of the losses. So we see that, the emerging, what we see in rural and small towns, the emerging working class, emerging in entrepreneurial class, emerging salaried class is being affected by the pandemic. We also see that, according to the study by Ashni Deshpande, women who were employed in the pre-lockdown phase were 23.5 percentage points less likely to be employed in the post-lockdown phase. The lockdown had a differential effect on caste groups as well, in that it affected the employment status of OBCs, SCs, and STs more adversely than it did for upper castes. So it goes on like this. So we see a very differentiated, uneven picture when it comes to job loss and unemployment during the pandemic. And at the same time, we have to be attentive to what's happening in the IT sector. So according to this job search website, Naukri.com, IT hardware sector has seen a growth of 10% in September when compared to the pre-COVID period of February. So if you compare pre-COVID period and now, IT sector has gained employment, there has been an increase in employment. On the other hand, but at the same time, this is in hardware, IT software still has to catch up to pre-COVID levels, down by 28% in October. But at the same time, roles such as technical content developer, solution architect, and database architect have seen a 350%. So there is a massive increase in certain sectors, which which means an expansion, which signal to an expansion of certain gig and platform economies. The scale and intensity with which the demobilization affected large numbers of people is different from a recession. There was a massive demobilization of labor that was unrelated to market force of supply and demand. So this is something that we need to note, that these changes are not like a recession or a depression where you see long-term changes in supply and demand affecting the economy. During other times too, labor is constantly demobilized, but this occurs along the lines of a spatial fix, as David Harvey has pointed out, demobilizing to be mobilized elsewhere. We see now a different kind of demobilization, one that is created outside the rules of the supply and demand. Indeed, the scale is enormous, but that is not all. There is the enforcement of a social contract of demobilization. Workers and individuals agreed to wear masks and stay at home, and in many parts of the world accepted layoffs and budget cuts in organization. The politics of touch and proximity during the pandemic has a functional role in this social contract of demobilization, where workers are informed of their essentialness, disposability, redundancy, and superfluity through the medium of the pandemic. Yet it would be a mistake to ascribe any intention or agency to capital as a class in initiating this demobilization. Just as the working class has been divided into touch and tech, essential and non-essential, or remote and on the spot, capital has been polarized too. Its interests are no more being served by the generalized exchange system and minimal state support. The fragmentation and centralization of capital through business cycles is a fundamental characteristic of capitalist development. But what differentiates the pandemic is that it accentuated such a dynamic not only on the lines of scale, but also along lines that delineate tech from the rest of the workers. What we see is tech-focused companies gaining further ground over manufacturing, and their centralization tendencies exceeding and destabilizing the viability of capital as a class. This is where the state comes into aid of capital, especially in the global north. And there is a socialist Keynesian, awakening, if you watch closely. The gains that companies like Amazon and Facebook made in the stock market and real estate market point to unsustainable levels of centralization, while other sectors, including sectors like retail, like very established companies like Victoria's Secret, many of them had to scramble to reorganize and reduce scale. And there are many sectors and scales of operation are wiped out or are forced to scale back. If a recession punishes small-scale capital unequally, while medium and big capital are bailed out by the state, depression requires massive amounts of state intervention that is not only about saving companies. It demands the creation of social infrastructure and collectivization of work under the supervision of state. However, what the pandemic has presented us with is not depression either. It is not a decline in economic activity that has developed over time, but one that was sudden and sharp. The state and large corporations came closer and consolidated each other's position during and before the pandemic, as Grace Blakely has written several books on the pandemic, and it's quite amazing how she documents this coming together of large corporations, especially these tech giants, and the state in Europe and the US. This is, however, not a new thing. We have to be careful in thinking of the pandemic as an exceptional moment when it comes to it. It actually intensifies certain tendencies. So there's this wonderful paper by Moose about, what happened during the long recession of 2008, 2012. The state in the US has stabilized capital by contributing to the social reproduction of labor throughout the second half of 20th century, but counterintuitively even more in the first decade of the 21st century, a period some would term neoliberal. So if you look at closely what was happening, it looks like the state was actually helping capital by redistributing to labor in the US. The state's redistributive efforts through stimulus checks and eviction moratoriums signal to the continuation of this trend of the state subsidizing and stabilizing the social reproduction of labor. But this also means that the state has subsidized fractions of capital that survived or flourished in the pandemic, like Amazon, and punished those who have not, like airline companies and restaurants. So when the state supports people, it has an effect on capital, but again in a differentiated way. So the ones who survived the pandemic or flourished during the pandemic, they are actually unfairly benefited through these Keynesian stimulus. So it's actually eviction moratoriums or stimulus checks are not that innocent when we are looking at it from the perspective of the global South. It actually stabilizes, the state and capital and strengthens capital in the North. So we see a complex reproduction of the touch tech dynamic in this process too. This mass demobilization. How much time do I have now?
We can take 5 more minutes. Is that?
Okay.
Yeah.
So so this again is a little bit focused on what is happening in New York. The inability to participate in collective consumption practices during the pandemic through relations of production in sharp relief. The abstractions required to live everyday life in a capitalist society broke down as the phantasmagoria of daily life disappeared or was restricted by rules of touch and proximity. The semblance of collective life through abstraction that capital enforces had shaken. As consumers, all classes are united by their highly commodified relationship to things. The way the rich, the middle class, and the poor consume commodities has been in a highly fetishized way. They do not usually care about where those come from or how they are made. But commodity production was once again at the center during the pandemic, and its obscuring by presentation and spectacle and fetishization was not smooth. This was from both demand and supply sides. There were huge anxieties about whether supply chains will break, that is, whether food will be cultivated, if cultivated, whether it will be harvested, if harvested, whether it will be transported, and if transported, whether it will reach us or diverted elsewhere. So people were actually forced to think of in a scalar manner about food. They were not thinking about it only in terms of, the ethical, whether it was ethically produced, but about, this simply the availability of it. So I think this had an effect, and I would trace a lot of movements that, came up during the pandemic, whether it is in the US or here, to this, that breakdown of that smooth functioning of the market, which opened up spaces, which made people aware of the possibility of such openings. As millions lost jobs and livelihoods, the debt-based system that propped up people's capacity to maintain their current and future consumption standards was thrown into disarray. The scale and diversity of commodity production is an important element in allowing commodity fetishism to thrive. The promise that there'll be more and more types and bigger sizes and more numbers of commodities to consume obscured the possibility of them ever running out. reminding the consumer that a thing is ethically produced or some such stab at the production process is not that relevant anymore. Instead, the massive demobilization of labor that occurred during the pandemic had a somewhat defetishizing effect on people. Amazon and Uber Eats made sure that people remained consumers, but the collective aspect of retail and consumption was removed. So we can say that the capitalist collective broke down because it depended on workplaces are coming together in workplaces and are coming together in the market, as consumers. So both these avenues for collective life was actually, broken. This is interesting. And these tech companies were instrumental in accentuating an already existing process of decollectivization of capitalism during the pandemic. We can also look at it through the lens of what Aniket Javare calls neutralization of touch, or the naturalization of involuntary touch between individuals gathered together in the metropolis and in spaces of consumption and transport. This naturalization of involuntary touch. So what he says that if you touch someone involuntarily in a society of acquisition, that is, in a Western metropolis, nobody would, it's not prescribed. And he terms places like India as societies of inheritance, where such naturalization of involuntary touch doesn't exist. So I thought this was gave us a more nuanced frame than simply saying that social distances is a throwback to untouchability. Javare seems to have more resources for us to kind of look at it. So this, I think I'll kind of stop here. There is also a little bit on, how, for example, some forms of protest have become a little obsolete. Because, for example, general strike. The state is already stopping. There is a massive stoppage. So many of the, old forms of working class protest, for example, a general strike, looks a little irrelevant in front of such stoppage. So the capacity of workers to, demand something through the means of work and stopping work has become less. So this is another interest. I mean, it was already less, because general strikes, even though in India we do it, it's also only in the organized sector that it's effective. So it kind of accentuated those processes where some forms of working class protest are, are rendered obsolete. And then I finish with that this relationship between touch-based and tech-based work will be contested. It's not as though, this will be an uncontested process and, we don't know how this will pan out in the coming days. But there already in the US, there is a big recovery, but there is not much of a recovery in workforce participation rates. It's still short 7 million people from the pre-pandemic levels, and it has gone back to 70s work participation rates, especially for women. So there is that, this is happening even amidst recovery. We are not seeing a big employment recovery or a work participation recovery. And many businesses were already aiming to not only automate. So it's not only a question of AI or automation, but it's also a question of how existing labor is being, there is a divergence in the way the labor is mobilized. That's all. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Maitri. I hope you got enough time that I didn't.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So that's a lot of very significant interventions that we could discuss, and I mean, it's also interesting that you are working through some of these things even as we are living through it, right? Like, so it's the capacity to to comment upon the context that one is part of, like how you started your presentation, is very interesting, like that, because some of these developments are still taking place, and we are grappling with these things, right? So I'm sure people have many responses, and we can open it up to questions. If you could either write your question in the chat box, or if you have specific questions, you can also do the hand raise function, and we can, even if you turn on your video and raise your hand, that's also fine. Like, I'm sure anything will work. But if you have questions you want, if you prefer writing it down, you could do that too. Since okay, we have one question here from Rennie. Should I just read it out, Maitri? I think that's simple. I'll just read it out, and then this is from Rennie Thomas. It says, Maitri, thanks for this very engaging talk. Do you think the pandemic has, from your observation and reading, helped in the growth of what David Graeber has called as bullshit jobs? Just curious.
Bullshit jobs is a very anarchist formulation, right? It actually calls CEOs and a lot of managerial positions as unnecessary and superfluous and pointless. And I mean, it's easy to say that, but we know that labor disciplining is very central to the production of value, and so we can't call them bullshit per se, because labor discipline, without this division between, without this minute division between different kinds of labor and what they do, and how the work is assembled across the globe in different places, this doesn't happen automatically like anarchists imagine. This happens through human intervention, and managerial and the CEOs and all of them do the hard work of making that happen. We can accuse them of profiteering, we can accuse them of exploitation, but how do you call them bullshit is beyond my, that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, Umakant, you want to go ahead and ask the question? If you can switch your video on, that would be nice. People who are asking questions, if possible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maitri, thank you very much for your presentation, but it seems you have not paid enough attention to the problems of sanitation workers in the metropolitan areas. I mean, see, even for a place like Delhi, I mean, so many sanitation workers' life got affected because of pandemic lockdown, and then number of hours that they had to work without getting proper remuneration, and also without getting proper protection materials, So I think that remains one area where not much has been written or talked about. Because I myself wrote a paper which was published in Countercurrents last year. It is titled as Discrimination and Exclusion During COVID-19 Pandemic Lockdown. I've mentioned several cases there, and rightly so, you also mentioned the paper by Ashwini Deshpande, but there are a couple of other papers also which have been written. But I think this particular issue of caste discrimination, especially targeting the sanitation workers, the Safai Karamcharis here in India, or even in other South Asian countries, it has been very pathetically bad, and state doesn't pay much attention to these people. They are treated as a second class or third class citizens. So I would like to know your comment on this. Thank you.
Smita Patil has done some interesting work on women sanitation workers, and I've attended one of her presentations, which details how the state actually produces these conditions, and which actually reminds me of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work too, where the state is central to. In fact, the Keynesian state, the welfare state, is central to the production of you know of the dispossession, as well as this racialized vulnerability to premature death. And vulnerability to premature death, I think, it actually touches upon the condition of sanitation workers in India.
Yeah. Thanks, Maitri. I'll now read this question here, like Partha Barua's question. It says, do you reckon the phantasmagorical ability of tech illiteracy was the main reason for alienation of compassion and understanding for the helpless migrants by the capitalist class during demonetization?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how to characterize whether, it's because is it capitalist class that was fundamentally, against the interests of these workers, or whether it was a combination of, a discriminatory state, even because I felt the capitalist class was actually quite helpless in front of that sudden announcement of lockdown. It actually showed the true colors of the state in India, where one, there is a lot of trust in the state from ordinary people. Second, that that it can command that trust in a very short, in a very short time period, and really enact this. So I felt that the lockdown and demonetization, all these events actually symbolized, actually kind of showed us that the capitalist class is not able to exert that much of it's on the state, on the current regime that much, because it actually was against the interest of the capitalist class to announce this lockdown, to close down suddenly without any consultations. I don't think Modi consulted the capitalist class in general, at least.
Any other questions, like or even comments? There was one point that I wanted you, I mean, while we are waiting for questions, in the beginning of the talk, Maitri, you were talking about this making a friend read your paper, and this whole question of the imagination of the state or capital, right? Like, could you sort of talk a little more about it, like what because at another point of time you were also saying that what this moment requires is not just analysis of culture, but more necessarily looking at political economy, right? Like, so what would, in the field of political economy, how would we then bring in the question of imagination, right? Like, how are you thinking about that concept?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I don't know how to answer it completely, but I felt that, political economy is very much interested in increasing state capacity. So, and especially state capacity as a welfare, as, with reference to welfare, increasing the reach of the state. And that's kind of an end of imagination, where it actually is not able to visualize socioeconomic change beyond the state. And whereas once you move into the anarchist spectrum, they just don't want the state there. Like, for example, how David Graeber would conceptualize or imagining would be without the state. So that is, I think, a very interesting dialectic. And at the same time, many of us who don't trust the state are also deeply, our interests are deeply enmeshed with the state, and this is very different. I've also was also thinking about, I skipped that part, where we talk about anti-mask and anti-vax activists in the US, and that's not the kind of right wing that we have here. Our right wing is interested again in increasing state capacity, actually, maybe not for welfare, but including a little bit of welfare. Actually, if you look closely at this regime, you see the expansion of the state in different ways. And our right wing is not very libertarian. It's very state. It's actually a very organic offshoot of the third post-colonial, state. This is what I mean. This is what that question of imagination, is in. It's I think that contradiction arises.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, there's another question that has come up. This is from Sargam Sharma. I'll just read it. It says, while I would agree that the pandemic has had a defetishizing role in the sense that if supply chains falter, the capital has to refurbish itself in some new way. To my mind, this has happened through text conditioning of the labor force, like being present for a few hours on an app instead of office hours, marking attendance and then leaving, etc. So while the tech sector may have seen a boom in some sectors, it has only been a stopgap measure, unable to paper over the failures of capital. I'm interested to know what you think about how use of tech has conditioned labor process and if it has been effective in the capitalist project.
Yeah, I broadly agree with, in fact, the whole purpose of the paper is also about, to look at that conditioning, or, the intensification of that conditioning, which has already started. I mean, it started much before the pandemic. It was waiting. I mean, some of the capital, sections of capital was waiting to unleash it on the workforce. So it actually, pandemic actually gave them an opportunity to do that in a more, nuanced, that they could put all those resources into, resources were being put into this kind of exercise, actually. But at the same time, as we have seen, it also breaks down collective life, metropolitan life, urban life, which is also central to the experience of capitalism and everyday life in capitalism. So how do we, I don't even want to say capitalism, but experience of daily life. So maybe you are actually right that it's not been very, it won't be very effective unless I feel that there is also another process that's underway, is the kind of revalorizing of some touch, like repurposing touch to create more value, in the sense that to make labor intensive production processes more valuable through intention, through state intervention or through the intervention of the elite. So those processes also would come in, I think.
I think there's a follow-up question that Partha Barua has. Do you want to just come on and ask your question, Partha? Or should I just read it out? If you want to switch it on and speak, that's also good for us. Okay. So, yeah, okay, I'll just read it out then. After the collapse of economy, after the aftermath of demonetization, where do you place the locus of power? On the marginalized other, the migrant workers, or it was never theirs to begin with?
I don't think the economy collapsed after demonetization. It was, we cannot fault for these kind of things, because it actually people suffered a lot. And who suffered? I feel that a lot of constituencies that supported the regime suffered through it, and put their trust there, and it affected certain sections of labor and capital, but it didn't collapse. So yeah, I don't know what to say.
Yeah.
Please.
No, that's
Oh, where do you place the locus of power? I mean, it's a very complex question, right? The locus of power in a, there is a lot of power in the hands of people, actually, the mob, but not really to make change. So I don't know what to say. I mean, this regime is very special, and you can't just say, it's actually, it has a big mandate. So, and it has come through democratic processes. So I wouldn't say that, people don't have power.
also, I think, like, in relation to some of the points you were making towards the end of the talk, when you were discussing, like, how, especially in the West, like, this, some of these shifts made you aware of, like, say, the scalar manner about food production, and some of, like, a certain kind of new attention to some of those processes, right? And then you were talking about how certain political movements that have emerged during the same time period, you could link to these shifts, right? So what, were there specific movements that you were thinking about, or what was the larger context you were keeping in mind when you were mentioning that? Mm-hmm.
So I was, I observed the George Floyd protest,
Mm-hmm.
and also there were a lot of, like, mutual aid activism that preceded that. There was a lot of housing rights activism that preceded it. So it coalesced into this large, movement. But at the same time, it was also the election time. So there was also a lot of co-option of those processes into the narrative of the election and to that bipolar, thing. But at the same time, what was the question?
No,
Yeah.
like, the link between these movements and a certain, attention to food production and this kind of commodity practices, right? Like, that suddenly, comes into public attention in a new way, right? Like, so, yeah.
Yeah, so it seemed to me, I mean, I'm not sure whether I'm right in, assessing another, place where I've lived only very short while, but I felt that, there was this, I mean, people were newly interested in material questions because it had inequality, and, material inequality had sharpened, and there was also a lot of intergenerational downward mobility is what I've seen, that, uh, children of parents who've had stable, secure jobs were not able to get stable, secure jobs. So that intergenerational downward mobility was across the spectrum. It was not something restricted uh, to people of color or, marginalized communities, but also very mainstream, like even who are so-called white would be, were affected. So that intergenerational downward mobility is an interesting thing that will actually, and if you look at those loots, that happened in New York of these big stores, it was a very mixed crowd. There were all kinds of people, and they were just, so that attack on property comes from lack of property, I've felt.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's an interesting set of connections because some of the movements obviously got a lot of global coverage, but like the links you're making is really interesting to think further about. Any other comments from some of our students or anything you want clarification on? Okay. That seems good then, right? Like,
Okay.
because I don't think there's anything that's come up in the chat box. No, not really. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Partho Barua again has. Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and speak? Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, what I meant was that uh, the industry exists because of the workers. The industry exists because of the workers, and the landlords in Delhi exist because of the outstation students. So if the in that if we look at that way, the locus of power is with the workers. So when they leave the area where the locus of powers uh, is shifted, then does it go back to the villages where they came from, or does it find uh, where, like, at that time situations are created in such a way that new uh, class of struggle comes to the front and they get the power of locus, like the political praxis, that is, the government as such, that engage with the capitalist magnates to demotivate the workers to go back to their places, because they were scared that the whole structure, the model of the power system, that because of which Noida exists and places like that, they will be helpless without the power that they get from the migrants. Because in example, when lockdown happened, even a place like Newark, it became totally empty, and it's supposed to be one of the most powerful the you know uh, economic zone. So that was what I wanted to know, where the locus of power it shifts. Does it get diminished, or it gets dormanted, or is it like the workers leave it behind for someone to take it over?
That's actually an interesting, way to think about it, and it reminds me of, the question of age.
Yeah, I would love to add. For example, the GB Road in Delhi and the Sonagachi in Calcutta, they exist because of the prostitutes. But since demonetization and after uh, lockdown and all, they are also worst hit. So, like, they also have a clientele who visits them. So, what happens to the client? What happens to them? They are the ones. They have the power. They are the ones who draw the customer to these areas, because these areas are famous because of them, because of their business, because of their profession. So because of demonetization, they somehow lose the power. They somehow, so where does it go? Where does it create a new client? Does it, like, what happens to this power struggle?
I think there is a reconstitution of the power struggle, if you were to ask me. But fundamental to this is the question of citizenship, right? Because the right to the city. So, and what the exodus of migrant workers teach us is that citizenship is still deposited in these subnational territorial formations. So, it's not something that is pan-Indian as we imagine, but people had to withdraw to their rural and small town uh, localities and origins, which meant that they primarily belonged there. So they straddled the urban and the rural, but when the question of citizenship arose in a very sharp way, they had to withdraw. So in that sense, the power struggle seems to be very, very unfair. It seems like the workers need to reassert that space constantly. Like they need to claim that space constantly to be powerful. So it's not as though power is constant. It has to be claimed and reclaimed. That space has to be claimed and reclaimed. The urban, the urban space in that sense. So it's not just a question of labor's power, but also a question of citizenship of the workers. I don't know whether you get the difference. When we just frame it only as a question of capital and labor, it's not, we forget about the nation state. The nation state that at once is, coming together and for surveillance and for all of these things, but at the same time, when it comes to welfare and supporting livelihoods, it just says, okay, now it's the states and the provincial small towns have to take care. The care work is deposited in these subnational entities.
Now that that we are at it, I would love to talk about the panoptical view through the lenses of caste, where a particular situation happened couple of months back, if I am correct. In a village, the whole Dalit community, they refused to the Dalit and the casteless people, they refused to collect the dead animals, especially cows and all. So it was left to the Brahmins to touch them and dispose of the carcasses of the dead animals. So by their refusal itself produced the praxis of power that they had none in the beginning. Their refusal itself created a power for them, and they realized they have a power over the Brahmins by refusing something that they have been doing for a long time. So what do you have to say about that?
What is the relationship with panopticon that you mentioned at the beginning?
Panopticon means
no, how is it related to this?
Okay, panoptical gauge of caste. I mean, through the lenses of caste. If you look through caste, because it's a caste, it's a caste thing. Like if you belong to a certain caste, you are not supposed to do certain things. You are not supposed to touch certain things. Some manual works are not for you. You're not going to do it. And all the people who come to your house to do the manual work, the scavengers work, they are supposed to belong. They actually belong to a particular caste, and they don't get other jobs otherwise.
I don't know what to say actually, because there has to be structural change, right? Not just refusing to do manual labor, refusing to do sanitation work, refusing to remove dead animals. These are important, but at the same time, when as many scholars have pointed out, state itself is organizing these modern casteist labor forms. How do we get into it? How do we address it? And in that question, I think you need to actually reverse. I mean, the panopticon question might be interesting from the point of view of how the state actually orients different kinds of labor in the city. And also the resilience of caste across rural and urban spaces. So even if you refuse to do that work in the rural, in the village, you might have to do it in the urban space where there is no ritual connotation to that. And refusing to do such a work would just be like just withdrawing from the labor force. What would you do then?
Okay, I'll tell you one real life example that happened. Kejriwal, he revolutionized some sections of the municipality. And before I live in Vijayanagar, Delhi. So the before people manual scavenger works used to be done by people who used to come either on foot or on bicycles, or they used to bring their thela. You know what is thela?
Yeah. The
Yeah,
cart.
yeah,
Cart.
yeah, cart. Yeah, I just forgot that. Yeah. So what happened after? I used to see them coming that way and cleaning the drains and all for years and years. But after some years, I saw uh, one. Recognized couple of them, and I saw one of them driving a sanitation car and cleaning the drain using electronic methods. I came down from. I came down and I approached them because I was happy and I was shocked and delighted, and I wanted to ask them some questions. And I told them, ki, like, I see you people in a different way, like I used to see you. They say, yes, we feel different. I said, are you happy now? Or you were like, do you see a kind of change? He said, of course, yes, because our jobs has been regularized and we no longer feel uh, as if we are doing something like, dirty, something work that is beneath human beings' dignity. Because we have a uniform, we have a identity card, we have a regular salary, and we have machines to work with. We don't, and I have gloves, I have cap, and I have proper uniform. I said that means the clothes and the gears that you got brought about a change in you. He said, yes, these are the things that brought a change in me. uh, so I think uh, in villages or in rural areas where, or even in urban areas where people just pick up random poor people to do the manual work, that is, they might not say, but I think for them that is beneath their dignity. But if you give them a proper dignified uh, certificate of labor employment, maybe even the work that looks undignified becomes a work of dignity.
I broadly agree, actually. I mean, but at the same time, we cannot, I mean, if it's still parceled out on the basis of caste, then we would have to say that, it still operates within caste system, even though there is some, improvement in the labor, the standards, and hence it, dignity. You're muted.
Yeah. Is there any other responses, or Papuri, you wanted to add something, or is there anything that Uh-huh.
I just want to, I mean, my interest here is to, not just look at the lower end of the labor spectrum, but to look at it together. So this is I mean, most of the time, researchers who are from privileged backgrounds, we automatically train our eyes when we say labor. We just look at the manual labor, or the labor that is least paid, or that is associated uh, with hierarchies of caste and gender. But at the same time, we need to look at the other side. So I would encourage, those who are coming from the privileged backgrounds to actually look at these things together than, training, because we are always trained in the Indian university system to look at workers who are least privileged, and we forget to look at, how different classes of workers operate and how they bargain, and what is the effect that, that combination has, that, that coming together of different types of labor has.
Okay. Yeah. I think there were a few hands up there, like Anukriti and Indu both had questions. So Anukriti, you want to go first? Oh, okay. Okay. It was a mistake, it seems. Okay, no problem. Yeah. Okay. Is that good then?
Yeah, it was great. And, thank you very much for having me and,
Yeah.
making this happen. Navanita and Papuri and Anukriti, all of you, and the Center for Women's Studies.
Yes. Thanks a lot, like, for engaging so well with all the questions and opening up this whole field for us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maitri. Yeah, sorry I got disconnected in the middle. Okay, all right.
No
Okay,
worries.
thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.